Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to get started. Just a few housekeeping items. We're going to try to keep the presentation itself to 45 minutes. We're going to leave time for questions at the end. Feel free to email those questions. It's the easiest way for us to kind of collectively look at them, and I will be sharing those questions at the end. The email address is on the screen. You've gotten emails from me. This is Kyle Berry. You've gotten emails from me in the past, so just hit reply to that and send us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them at the end, and then we'll have the opportunity for you to contact people individually as well if you have specific questions about a certain topic. So today we have a panel of presenters that you're going to be pretty excited about, and hopefully you get a lot of information from. And we have 45 minutes for this. There's a lot of opportunity for us to go much deeper in each of these topics. We obviously don't have that time today. So again, if you at the end of the presentation, the contact information from each of our presenters will be shared at the end. Feel free to reach out to them directly with certain specific questions that you may have that we just didn't cover during this 45 minutes. So, and also when they get to the presentation of their portion of the presentation, they will be introducing themselves and providing a review of their expertise. So you can you'll get their information at that point. For the agenda today, much like you saw in the invitation, we're going to cover a basic overview of what an OBL is, what's the setup process, legal considerations, software and technical considerations when setting up an OBL, and then we'll talk about revenue cycle and coding and stuff like that and what you need to know. And again, we will wrap up with a Q&A. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first presenter, Ginny Martin with Ginny Martin and Associates. Jenny, go.
Hi, thanks, Kyle. I'm Ginny Martin. I'm a healthcare consultant. I work with just about every specialty, assisting providers with resolving operational issues, whether they're revenue cycle or policies and procedures, etc. I also served as Vice President of Operations for several large hospital-owned health systems in Ohio and Washington, D.C. Can you advance the slide, Kyle?
Yep.
Okay, we're going to be talking about the office-based lab setup process and what that entails. There we go. Okay, this is an overview of the process and the first step. So what is an office-based lab? The definition can really vary by state, but most generally, in most states, it's an office-based setting where invasive or diagnostic and surgical procedures are performed. And typically the term surgical or invasive is classified by the type and level of sedation or anesthesia that's required. So when we're talking about an ambulatory surgery center, we're talking about, higher level procedures that require a higher level of anesthesia. So it has its own set of rules and regulations, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Many times an OBL will be combined with the space that's designated as an ambulatory surgery center or an ASC. And that same space can be used separately for both things, usually on alternate days. And the way that works is when you submit the application for certification for your ASC, you indicate what days that space will function as an ASC and what days that space will function as an office-based lab. So you can use the same space for both things. The most important step you can take in this process is to engage the services of a healthcare attorney who works with clients having OBLs. There are a plethora of regulations and rules that you need to follow, and you need someone who's skilled that can help you through that process. Also, a healthcare CPA who works with healthcare clients that can help you do a pro forma and figure out whether this is going to be a profitable endeavor for you. And also a healthcare consultant who works with clients who have set up OBLs and are knowledgeable about the operational issues. So the first steps are, this is where the advice of your carefully chosen advisors will be very valuable. If you decide to simply create an office space lab, and it's not simple, but you just want to keep it as simple as possible. So you want an office space lab within your practice. There's still some questions that you need to answer. Number one, will the OBL be used only by the providers in your practice? Or will you want your OBL to be used by other providers of the same specialty? Perhaps you're in a call group with providers that are in your same specialty and who want to perform the services in your space. So there's a bunch of rules that are associated with that, both regulatory and legal requirements. So your healthcare attorney and the CPA can assist you in determining the most favorable IRS structure for your entity. In other words, are you going to create a separate corporate entity, an LLC, etc.? Drafting income distribution formulas, and this is where you have to be really careful. So especially if you have outside providers who are providing services in your space, you have to figure out a way to reimburse them for the services that they perform that doesn't violate federal Stark and anti-kickback laws. That's where your healthcare attorney comes in and is very valuable. Kyle, can you advance the slide for me, please? If you choose to combine your office space lab with an ambulatory surgery center, then the rules change. Again, your carefully chosen advisors can help you. ASCs typically require a separate entrance and egress, but this can be from your existing space. So if you have a fairly large waiting room, you can have the entrance and the egress from your ambulatory surgery center on one side and your office space entrance and egress on the other side. ASCs typically require accreditation, and this will vary by state and it'll vary by insurer. Certainly, if you're dealing with federally funded programs, this will become more important. ASCs typically allow more complex procedures to be performed, and that's what I was referring to earlier. So it's going to require higher levels of anesthesia, which in turn require recovery and monitoring areas. So you need to take that into consideration if you're thinking about an ASC combo. An ASC typically requires higher level of staff certification. So you're dealing with patients who are more heavily sedated, so they need to have certain certifications. And again, some of that's going to vary by state. Emergency equipment like a crash cart and transfer agreements in place with hospitals to deal with emergencies. ASCs can allow billing of a facility fee in addition to the professional fees. So again, that depends on the state and the insurer involved, but where that becomes critical is when you're doing a pro forma and trying to figure out whether it's a profitable endeavor. If you can bill a facility fee in addition to the professional fee, that certainly ramps up the reimbursement. Kyle, can you advance to the next slide, please?
I think you're okay.
Now that you've chosen the desired structure of your entity, whether it's going to be just an OBL or whether it's going to be an OBL ASC combo, you need to look into the state requirements for the setup process of your entity. In other words, what's required in terms of licensure, what's required in terms of accreditation. And if you engage the services of a healthcare attorney who's familiar with this process, most of the time they can tell you that right off the top of their head. Also, researching procedure-specific limitations by state and by insurance. So some insurers and some states won't allow certain services to be performed within an ASC. In other words, those services always have to be performed in a hospital situation. Having your healthcare attorney perform a pro forma for you. So you're going to calculate the cost against the potential revenue. And you need to take into account everything. So licensure, that's going to be a cost. Your certification will be a cost. And any construction costs. So again, we were talking earlier about an ASC requiring a separate entrance and egress. If you need to do construction in your office suite in order to accommodate that, that's a cost that you need to take into consideration. Also, your staffing, your equipment, supplies, etc., all of that's going to be based upon the findings of your research. So begin to research insurers to ascertain things important to the financial success of your OBL or your OBL ASC. So you want to look at the top insurers, your top 5, 10 insurers. Will they pay for professional services provided in an OBL or an ASC, or do they have closed panels of facilities? So some insurers negotiate with certain facilities at a reduced rate in return for providing them all of their patients. So, you know, we see this in labs, we see this in diagnostic centers. Will they pay a facility fee in addition to the professional fee in an OBL or an OBL ASC? And we talked about that a moment ago. Researching billing issues, procedure codes that can be reported with a place of service. And the place of service is going to be different, whether it's an OBL or whether it's an ASC. So you need to know by insurer what they require. And this can also vary by state. Again, your healthcare attorney is going to be very knowledgeable in helping you wade through that, that maze. Negotiating reimbursement with insurers, and then credentialing your facility as an OBL or an OBL ASC. So what's required in all of that? Also, researching your malpractice coverage for your OBL or your OBL ASC. You can't just presume because you have malpractice insurance that covers your practice, if you decide to open an OBL or an OBL ASC, that those services will automatically be covered. One of the things that you need to consider is if your OBL or your OBL ASC is going to be open to other providers, you have to research the ramifications of your malpractice and the insurance for your facility to find out what you need to have in place to protect yourself and to protect your practice. Then the final steps. You need to proceed with accreditation, whatever form that takes. A lot of states utilize the health department to do the accreditation, or there are some national firms that do that. And if you have an option, you'll want to choose whatever is the quickest. So if there's a national firm or a national entity that provides accreditation, but you know they're working 6 months out, you may be able to use your local health department and have that happen sooner. And then you're going to proceed with credentialing of your facility. Well, what does that mean? So credentialing is you need to credential your facility as a location with various insurers. And again, remember we talked about some insurers have closed panels, so you won't be able to credential with those insurers. You need to know all of that up front before you get to this process. And then developing the operational policies and procedures required, as well as your corporate minutes and all of those things that will be required depending upon how you set it up as an IRS entity. Then you need to prepare contracts with outside physicians. And again, most of these things can be facilitated by your healthcare attorney. If it's an open facility, finalize compensation arrangements among the physicians within the group and arrange for adequate certified staff. Again, we talked about that earlier. That's going to be one of the costs to you. And then arranging for construction if it's required for your entrance, egress, or a separate space for your OBL. And then ordering supplies and equipment, and then choosing a billing company that has handled OBL billing in the past. So then it's time to put on your lab coat or your scrubs and your mask and go to work in your new OBL or ASC. I would like to introduce Amanda Weish. Amanda is Vice President of Brennan, Manna & Diamond, and I have worked with Amanda on a number of clients, and she is so knowledgeable. So Amanda, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. That was a great introduction and setup of the overall process, and I appreciate your kind comments. Jenny is spectacular as a consultant and really helping to manage the whole process, which I will talk about at the end of my presentation. As Jenny stated, I'm an attorney with Brennan, Manna & Diamond. We are a full-service law firm, but we are probably most known for our healthcare practice, which is a national healthcare practice. And we are also designated as a Becker's Top 10 healthcare law firm, which we are really proud of that designation. We opine on OBL structures, we help set up OBLs, and we ensure that they are compliant. So next slide, please. So I always start, again, I'm just going to be presenting from the legal perspective, but I always start with meeting with the clients and saying, what's the deal? What is the deal? What are you looking to do? Can you go back a slide, please? Thank you. So when I started my career, my mentor, who is an attorney that recently retired from our practice, whenever I would walk into his office, he would say, don't start talking or asking questions until you tell me what the deal is. What is the deal? What are the business terms? What are the parties trying to achieve? And we as attorneys need to understand what the deal terms are, what the goals and objectives from a business perspective are, so that we can ensure that the deal is compliant and that it achieves the objectives that the parties desire. So when I meet with clients, I always ask them, what is the deal? Tell me your deal terms, tell me your wish list, tell me your business goals. What are you trying to accomplish? And also, are you trying to avoid anything? Is there a problem that you're trying to solve? Maybe you have a competitor in your market. But if you tell me what the deal is, my job as legal counsel is to listen to your business terms and then put a compliant legal structure around it. Legal should never come in and just drop a form deal on your laps. Legal should come in and help you put a legal structure around what your business goals are. Next slide. So the first place that we start is identifying the legal entity and who's going to be part of that legal entity. And for that, we must first look to state law. State law is going to dictate what legal entity vehicles are available to us. Is there an LLC? Is there a professional corporation? Is there a PLLC? So state law is going to tell us what type of vehicle we should use. State law is also going to tell us who can have ownership in that entity. Are you in a state where there's a corporate practice of medicine, meaning only licensed professionals can have ownership? So you need to tell me, who do you want to own the OBL? If you are going to have non-physician ownership, we need to make sure that it's structured appropriately. Oftentimes, if you're partnered with a development and management company, they will want some ownership piece. They'll want some skin in the game. And so we got to figure out, okay, where are we going to put them from an ownership perspective? And then who are the parties? Are we just talking about physicians in one group? Are we talking about a couple of groups coming together and forming an OBL? And that's going to dictate how we structure the deal as well. And then also, what are your short-term and long-term goals? Oftentimes, we will consider entity formation based on what the goals are. Is this something, are you forming this or entering into the OBL relationship to be a more cohesive group, maybe serve as a recruitment tool for younger physicians that want to be more entrepreneurial? Or are you looking to build something up and then sell it in 2 to 3 years? All of my clients are different. They all have different short-term and long-term goals. And so we want to make sure that we structure it appropriately so that we can achieve those goals. Now, thank you. So when we talk about how the entity should be structured, it's going to be really important to focus on who's going to have ownership of the entity. And oftentimes we're going to be looking at, is this going to be an extension of an existing group where just the group owns the OBL and is referring to the OBL and providing services in the OBL? Or do we have multiple groups coming together to own a separate standalone entity? And there's no right or wrong answer. Again, it's going to depend largely on state law, but how we structure that entity or structure the OBL is going to be really important. There's pros and cons of both structure, but primarily we're going to be looking at the anti-kickback statute and the Stark law as well as state law. So there's going to be limitations depending on how you structure it. So here I put together a very simple matrix so you can see the differences between an OBL that's operated as part of a practice or an OBL that is really a joint venture standalone entity with multiple physician owners or multiple groups having ownership. So if you operated as part of the group, the OBL is still operated under the group EIN. It's going to be under the group payer contracts. Again, you're going to have to add on fee schedules and do credentialing, as Jenny talked about. But it may be easier to obtain financing, start compliance. It's going to be much easier. And we're going to be looking at the state corporate practice of medicine laws with respect to non-physician ownership, which likely is not going to be a problem if it's an extension of the group. And you may be able to tack on that OBL to the existing group practice location. So we may not have any significant real estate investments as well. Now, if it's a standalone entity, you're forming a whole new entity. So you're getting a new EIN, a new NPI, a new PTAN. So you're starting from the ground up with respect to corporate formation and negotiating payer contracts and credentialing. Typically, it's going to require a much larger equity investment. So we typically recommend a syndication with a PPM. That's a private placement memorandum. And you also may have additional layout for real estate investments or lease obligations. And so your owners may have a larger financial hurdle to get over, or possibly maybe even some personal guarantees or some guarantees of the group practice that's going to be investors. Oftentimes with standalone entities, we will see development and management companies come in because they can often bring capital to the table and then also some operational expertise. And so we typically see that with the standalone entities. And the Stark law is going to be a little bit harder to comply with because we're not going to be able to meet some exceptions. So we have to be very cognizant of the services that we're providing in a standalone entity to make sure that they are not, they don't fall within the definition of a designated health service under Stark. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so once you determine, you know, what's the deal, you have examined the pros and cons of both, of all your options, and you've settled on a structure. Now is the time where you go from what I call the dating phase to getting married. So now it's time for us to look at the documents and figure out how are we going to govern ourselves in our new partnership, which is essentially a marriage. Because once you enter into that partnership, now you're going to owe all of your other partners a fiduciary duty. And there's fiduciary duties to take actions that are in the best interests of the entity and also in the best interests of your other partners. So this really is a marriage. So Jenny did a great job of setting up the different steps of getting an OBL open from start to finish. And I know that Tara is also going to go into that as well. But you almost have two tracks of negotiations. One is getting the OBL up and running, but the other is figuring out how we are going to operate in our partnership and getting your corporate documents in order. So we're going to be talking about who's going to manage the OBL. Is that going to be a separate management company, or are you going to have a board, or is it going to be managed by all of the physician owners? Are you going to have a non-compete or a non-solicitation? How do new members come in? How do you remove a member? What happens if we come in and someone comes in with an offer to purchase, or we want to sell to someone? So we have to walk through a lot of those sticky issues, which may be uncomfortable, but you want to make sure that going into the marriage, you know what the rules are so that everybody is compliant, you know, once we finally seal the deal. Next slide, please. So as Jenny touched upon, you may want an OBL, but you may also need to consider building the OBL to an ASC spec or having an OBL/ASC hybrid. Now, where legal gets involved is we will help you look at state licensure laws. Oftentimes, states will license OBLs and ASCs differently. And so there are some pros and cons to operating as one or the other, or operating as a hybrid. Hybrid entities, you want to make sure that you're completely compliant. So you're going to have some additional contractual requirements. You're going to have appropriate licenses. You're going to have schedules for when you operate as an OBL or an ASC. And so we just want to make sure that you know which category you're going to be when we go to open, so that we can make sure that it's structured in a compliant way. So in addition to the licensure rules, some other things that you'll want to consider are, what types of services are you desiring to provide? Where are the reimbursement trends going? Where have they been? Where are they going? We also want to be cognizant of what's called place of service contracting. Different payers may give more favorable rates depending on the place of service, and we can see that trend nationally. We know that payer trends are moving from an inpatient level of care to outpatient to ASC to OBL or office-based. So we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of place of service contracting. And if we're taking on any risk in our payer contracts, we want to make sure that we have the appropriate level of care and that we're billing under the appropriate place of service code. Another thing to remember is that a lot of OBLs will be built to the specifications of an ASC, but they may not obtain ASC licensure. So essentially you're building the facility to have some enhanced value, so that if buyer comes along, or if you need to switch over to an ASC, you're able to do that, and that creates value. One of the hindrances, though, is that if you don't become licensed as an ASC, those laws could change over time. And so when you go to be licensed, or if you sell and the seller, the buyer wants to operate that location as an ASC, if there's a change in law, you may not be grandfathered because you would not have been licensed. So if you bill to the specifications of an ASC, you'll need to take the additional step of, well, do we become licensed and operate as an ASC or a hybrid, so that we can be grandfathered in under the state law requirements. Okay, next slide, please. As Jenny stated, it's so important to choose the right partners. I always tell my clients, whether it's an ASC, an OBL, a new hospital, or even starting a physician practice, it is a puzzle. It's a puzzle, and everyone has a different piece of the puzzle, and that puzzle at the end of the day has to fit very nicely together. And so you'll want to make sure that you choose the right partners. You want to make sure that you choose the right consultant, the right lawyer, the right architect, someone that is knowledgeable with the state law requirements and also has contacts within the departments that will be approving your structure and doing the inspections. You want to make sure that you choose the right partner with respect to management and operations, whether that person is in-house or is an independent contractor. As Jenny mentioned, you want to make sure that you choose the right partner with respect to billing and collecting. And all of these partners should understand what your deal is. So they've got to know the deal, and they have to know what your goals and objectives are. And someone needs to be in charge of the partners, making sure that everyone is completing their piece of the puzzle, so at the end of the day, it fits together very nicely. So with that, I will turn it over to Tara Vale, who is the Chief Operating Officer of HST Pathways.
Sorry, I couldn't get myself unmuted. My apologies. Hang on. I apologize. I'm trying to get myself unmuted for a second. So thank you very much. I appreciate that, Amanda. Just a quick introduction of myself. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, as Amanda said, of HST Pathways. ASC software. I also sit on the board of the California Ambulatory Surgery Center Association. My background is deep in revenue cycle management and workflow optimization. So I also handle the software product management and services at HST. And my background in that revenue cycle management is very much around radiology, surgery, anesthesia lab, and several things that cross over in this world of OBLs and ASCs. So I'm going to talk to you today really from a software perspective and help you really understand. And both Jenny and Amanda mentioned these three business models of an OBL or an ASC and hybrid. So I want to talk a little bit deeper about that. And then the unique aspects about the contracting and billing of these two different models. And briefly touch on interfaces and some of the key things you just want to make sure that your software can do as you go into this. Next slide, please. So office-based labs is an area that is really exploding and expecting to explode, especially over the next 7 years. And this is really being driven in part by Medicare approving the cardiology procedures in an ASC space. So as they look at this, and I'll talk about reimbursement in just a minute, but as you look at these ASCs being able to do stints and some other low risk procedures, you're going to see this combination of office-based labs and ASCs more, because reimbursement is different in these two settings, and being able to optimize that and optimize the care for the patient. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about these two particular models. And next slide, please. So to really pictorially describe these two different or three different models, you really have three different flavors: the ASC, the OBL, and the hybrid model. So the ASC is the functional model of the ASC is very standard. So it's place of service 24, it's the OBL 11 for the OBL space, and then you have the hybrid, which means you need two different businesses, two different softwares, and two different tax IDs, because they're completely separate models. So with the ASC model, the functional as an ASC, meaning that you need inventory, you need case costing, you need block scheduling. And in the OBL model, it's really very much like what we're talking about with the office-based lab, where that office-based lab of place of service 11, there's a chance that you've got two different things, where you may have one claim, which is global billing, or you may need two claims where you're billing both the technical and the professional. And that's really based on your contracts and your reimbursement models with your particular payers. So if you're doing the global, it's really similar to what you would do with an ASC for a bundled payment. The other thing that's important, and it's both for the ASC and the OBL space, is the importance of having interfaces to the modalities like a hemodynamic. So I'll touch on that as well. With the hybrid ASC OBL, you do need two separate tax IDs, which means you're going to need two separate licenses for your software. So even though it's the same physical space, you may or may not share demographics and some of the enterprise tables, such as like your payers and your transaction codes and things like that, but they are two distinctly separate businesses, even if they're occupying the same space. So you do require all of the same things related to an OBL as well as an ASC. So talking about reimbursement, this is really an interesting thing, because when we talk about some areas for critical success, being able to distinctly see that though you can do a procedure in either place of service 11 or in the ASC 24, place of service 24, the reimbursement is really different in some ways. So if we just look at like the stint 37226, you can get paid twice as much almost just by having it in place of service 11 over the ASC. Similarly, just as you look down, you can clearly see that they're more beneficial in one place or another. So as we talk about the critical success factors for running that hybrid model, training that scheduler and evaluating that reimbursement right up front is really important. There's a lot of money at stake on that. So as you're looking at possibly having a hybrid model where maybe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday you operate as an ASC, and on Tuesday, Thursday, you are operating as an office-based lab. So same space, but again, 2 separate software licenses. Then that scheduler who is looking to bring in a patient should be very well versed and trained on the reimbursement to determine which day of the week, really, where do you want to put this patient in to optimize that reimbursement. So the second really important critical success factor is your coding staff. It's essential. Cardio and vascular coding is very specialized. So investing in a certified coder and giving them some refresher training is a more expensive resource for your business office staff, but it will pay dividends in the back end to make sure that you're optimized on how you're getting reimbursed and what you're getting reimbursed for. I mentioned this earlier for number 3, which is the ASC procedure. When you're billing out the ASC procedure, you're billing one claim, and then the physician's billing their claim, anesthesiologist is billing their claim. Bundled payments is becoming more and more common, but typically when you're looking to bill an ASC, no matter even if it's a bundled reimbursement, it's one claim. Where in an OBL procedure, it could be one claim where you're bundling in both technical and the professional, they call it global billing, or it could be 2 claims where you have a technical bill and a professional bill. So you want to make sure that you have a software that can accommodate that various scenarios where you may need to drop 2 claims for that OBL procedure. And when you're negotiating with your payers, those carve-outs for the implants and the stents, while carve-outs are very common in an ASC for implants and making sure that you can get cost plus a percentage or carving it out so that your flat rate fees don't include implants and you can get paid on top of that. You want to make sure that that's clearly spelled out for the OBL as well. And then last, it is very important to track your implants and make sure that you have a software that you can track those implants, because the serial number and all of those things that are going in, you want to be able to report on that. So a little bit about interfaces, and I just want to talk about this because there are dedicated hemodynamic systems, there are dedicated cardio imaging systems. Those systems do really well for what they do to make sure that that procedure is safe and is tracking all of the things that are needed. I'm going back a second. Kyle, go back one. Kyle, can you go back one, please? Thank you. So to talk about the interfaces, your practice management software is going to have to interface with that hemodynamic system or cardio imaging system. So the most common interfaces really are the ORM message, which is the orders. It's an outbound orders message, and the inbound ORU, which is a results message, so that your any of the results from that hemodynamics can be stored within your practice management system. So you may hear things like ADT and SIU, and just to LMNOP kind of spell out what those things are. So ADT is your demographics interface, and SIU is a scheduling interface. So some systems may want both of those, or an order interface. It kind of bundles both of those things together for one outbound interface. But the ORU is a results inbound, so that would just be the only one you would need. So next slide, please. So the last thing I want to talk about is the importance of your billing software. And it really tees things up for John, who's going to talk more about this on the revenue cycle side. But you really want to make sure that your billing software gets clean claims paid fast. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of dynamic cardio imaging types of systems and the hemodynamics, but they aren't necessarily designed to get you paid. And if you're going into this service line, as in any area of healthcare, getting paid for your services and getting paid the first time is really critical to the success of your business. So pay attention to the ability to track the nuances for a payer contract, like the carve-outs, like the possibility of having to drop 2 claims. You may need certain payment terms that are based on those technical and professional modifiers. Be sure that you can review the reimbursement estimates for your contracts so that you can predict some of your net revenue. This goes back to making sure your contracts are loaded and that you have an idea of when you're scheduled, what you've got scheduled. Is it better for it to be in an OBL? Is it better to be in ASC, and schedule accordingly? And then, of course, you know, the accommodating all of your ASC needs and all of your OBL needs. You may grow in the future. So even if you start with an OBL or you start with an ASC, because this is a model that is really expanding, you just want to make sure that you've got the tools in place from the beginning to expand as your business model expands. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to talk a lot more about how to be successful in that reimbursement.
Thank you, Tara. So my name is John Adams. I am with the business side. Somebody advance my slides quickly. I have been in healthcare sales for 30 years or so, and I've been in revenue cycle sales for the last 10 years. So let me see if I can move on to the next slide. There we go. We're playing a slide tag here. Okay. So usually when I do this presentation, it's in front of a large live crowd, and I just throw this slide up there and wait for the chuckles. But obviously there's a story to be told here. They say in life that the only 2 things that are certain are death and taxes. I would like to add a third item to that, and that is, if something can be done wrong, it will be done wrong. And that applies to billing and collection, or your revenue cycle, as well as it does everything else in life. So let's talk a little bit about how to make sure things don't go wrong with your revenue cycle. The first thing I want to talk about is, I don't like the name revenue cycle. And let me get a little bit basic here. I know we have a handful of physicians within this group, and some of you may be coming from a hospital setting, and you just haven't been exposed to the term revenue cycle, or what is involved in a revenue cycle. And a case in point is, for us, we took over a rather large OBL a couple years ago, and they were doing great on the clinical side, but their billing was a mess, to be quite honest. And so when we came in, we did an analysis of what had happened, where they were, and I was giving a presentation. I had the graphs and the benchmarks and the tables up and everything. I was about halfway through the presentation, and one of the physicians raised his hand and said, "What is this AR you keep talking about?" And I knew right then I was over talking my audience. So we're going to step back a little bit and talk about what is a revenue cycle and what's involved within it. And as I said, I don't like the term revenue cycle because it's not a cycle. It really isn't. If you look right here, the reporting and benchmarking does not flow right back into charge capture. Not when you're thinking of an OBL or an ASC in a case, an individual case. It's a defined start and a defined stop to the process. I like to think of it as more of a production line. You know, think of it as a manufacturing production line. What do you see? You've got raw material, sheet metal, you've got plastics, screws, wires, whatever. They come in at the beginning of the production line, and then you bend them, cut them, paint them, do whatever you need to do through it. And at the end of the production line, you have a toaster or a washing machine or a car, or something along those lines. And if all your raw material is good, and if all the steps in the production line are correct, what comes out the end is perfect. But as you can see on this slide, there's another way you can come off the production line, and that is as a reject. In the case point, rejects happen. If it can be done wrong, it will be done wrong, and that's how we get rejects. The trouble with rejects is, number one, they're expensive because your most skilled employees have to come in and fix and do the rework on those rejects. There's a delay in the production, obviously, to get that rework done before something can be put back into the production line and come out the back. And sometimes it's damaged so badly that it becomes waste. You just have to throw that away, and you never get the end product. So, you know, I think we can all visualize what a manufacturing production line is. I want to talk about it in terms of a revenue cycle or revenue production line. Instead of wire and sheet metal and stuff as your inputs in your raw material, you're going to have patient demographics and the procedures performed, payer information, coding, that type of thing going into your revenue production line. And the product we're looking for, or the products we're looking for, are twofold. Money, obviously, to keep your ASC and OBL going, and patient satisfaction. And if a revenue cycle or revenue production line is done correctly, you get paid and your patient finds it to be relatively painless. That's hence the satisfaction. So the key to a smooth running production line is to have a tight process. Now, we've been in business 24 years. We're constantly working on our process to improve it. If the process isn't working for you for whatever reason, you need to, you know, update it and change it around. We also tweak our process for every individual client. We look to make it fit their strengths and their weaknesses. It's essentially, you got to play the cards you were dealt, not what you wished you'd been dealt. So while you're designing your revenue cycle, your processes within your organization, look at the strengths and weaknesses that you have and then work to those needs. And then once you have that process in place, train your employees to be fanatical, tenacious, religious about following the process. That, without a doubt, is the best way to get the end product out the door, is to have a tight process and people well trained to follow that process. You know, if you get to rejects in your revenue production line, it is going to cost you time and money. You know, your most expensive employees are the ones that work those payer rejections. It's not the data entry people doing that. It's people that have a strong knowledge base and they cost a lot more. So you're going to tie them up on those rejects, and that's going to be more expensive to you. It's also going to delay you getting paid because it takes time to work those rejects out of the revenue cycle. And finally, sometimes you just won't get paid, and that's lost money for you. The fix is easy if you do have rejects, and that is retrain or replace your employees. Look at the people doing it. If they can be retrained to follow that process that works, do so. If they need to be replaced, and not everything works for everybody. Some people are very good at repetitive tasks. Other people are better at complicated tasks, making those phone calls, doing the investigation, finding out why things are rejected. Put the right people in the right spot, and your production line again will flow forward. If you've got your employees trained, you got your production line tight, the rest of it is easy. I promise you that. And as a case in point, over 30% of our claims are paid within the same calendar month that those claims are filed. So now we know what a revenue production line looks like. Let's talk about a couple of the inputs, the raw materials that go into it. The first is the pre-authorizations. It's critical to get your authorizations done before you do your procedures, or more, let me rephrase that, before your claims are filed. Having to go back and retroactively approve a procedure after the claim has already gone to the payer, it's time consuming, it's costly, and it just sets you up for denials. So get those pre-authorizations done ahead of time. And I understand things may change. You may plan to do one set of procedures and you get in there and see something you weren't expecting, and a different set of procedures need to be done. Our advice to you is get as wide a range of procedures approved as possible. We have a different client that they only do a range of procedures between 37220 and 37231, those 11 procedures. So when we can, we get all 11 procedures authorized ahead of time for them, and that just makes life much easier if they do make the changes from what they plan going in. Our second input I want to talk about is coding. Coding in an OBL is extremely specialized, and your coder is the key person in your production line, without a doubt. Not any old coder can do this. The procedures are complicated. There's lots of modifiers that make a huge difference in the reimbursement amount. And let's be frank, the dollar amounts are quite high. So on our side, to address this, we make sure that our coders are specifically trained in either vascular surgery or IR or both. We mentor all of our coders during a probationary period, and we don't release them on their own until we have 100% confidence in their coding work. And then even after they're on their own, all of our coders, even the most experienced ones, are continually audited along the line to make sure that they are continuing to hold our high standards. And one of the keys we have, it goes back to the previous slide and the previous input, is that the coder should always review the procedure notes against what has been authorized. And if things have changed and they can determine that the procedures that were done are not what was authorized, they need to notify your authorization team to make sure that they go out and get those authorizations before that claim is originally submitted. So you can still make that change, even though the procedures have been done. You can get your authorization as long as the claim hasn't gone out, and it's still considered a pre-authorization instead of a retroactive. So the time to correct that is before the claim is filed and not afterwards. I know we're running late on time, so I'm going to go really quick on a few recipes for success in your revenue production line. The first one is keep it simple. You know, is it easier to build a toaster or a car? I recommend, if you're just opening an OBL, start with your simplest procedures first. Your clinicians will appreciate it, but your office staff will more greatly appreciate it. Let them get their feet wet and let them get their routine going on simple procedures before you start bringing the more complex stuff over from the hospitals. You may lose a little money up front, but you're going to win out in the long run because you're going to have less early rejects. The next thing is clearly define the roles and the expectations. This is part of the process, but it's important to emphasize. Make sure that each teammate knows their roles, and if you're using a billing vendor, make sure that both parties understand what is the responsibility of the practice, the OBL, the ASC, and what is the responsibility of the vendor. Put that in writing, have it clearly defined so that there is no question about that, because the last thing you want is people pointing fingers at each other. I thought you were going to take care of that type of situation. And finally, there's some fail points I want you to watch out for. Verification is usually the responsibility of the facility itself. It should get done at the time of scheduling. If there's no pre-authorization going on, or required for whatever reason, I also recommend that you do verification the night before the procedure is scheduled, just to check that nothing has changed between when you put them on the schedule and the day you're going to actually go out there and do the work. Some physicians, and not all, but some are notoriously slow of getting their documentation completed. And this can hold up your production line. And the end result is delayed reimbursement. So you need buy-in from your entire physician group that they're going to get their documentation completed within 24, 36 hours, whatever number you guys want to assign. But and anybody that doesn't get their documentation completed kind of goes up on the bad boy board to peer pressure them to get that going. And then finally, watch out for your aging AR. Anything that's in the 30, 45-day bucket, that gets seen daily. Everybody's watching that. That's fine. Once it gets out there, you have a chance of it going out of sight, out of mind type of situation. So again, your process should have you addressing your age AR. Make sure who, what, when, who touches it, how it gets touched, when it gets touched, that whole thing, and have that written out and make sure your process is followed. And whoops. Back to you, Kyle, and I just screwed it up. I'm not sure how I got to that.
No problem.
There.
There we go.
Yep, there you go.
Well,
all right, go to the next slide. There you go.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks everyone else. We had some really good information here from all the different presenters. We are running low on time. We've got 5 minutes. And we do have some questions that did come in, and we'd like to at least share some of those questions with the group and get some feedback. If technology would participate, I'm trying to unmute the folks, but doesn't look.
Pico.
What you got against tomatoes?
It's not, it's,
Let's see. All right. The first question we have is for Ginny. Question is, if I decide to go with a hybrid OBL ASC, what types of additional certifications does my staff need to have?
Okay, that's going to depend, and I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it's really true. It's going to depend on the kinds of procedures that you do, and it's also going to depend on insurer and state requirements. So, for instance, you may need to have staff certified in CPR. You may need to have an RN or an LPN, especially if you're an ASC, kind of overseeing like the recovery area, etc. You also may need to have an anesthesiologist on site overseeing several CRNAs. It depends on the size of your entity, how many surgery rooms you have going at the same time, and how many procedures you have going. So it's really going to vary. It's going to vary by state, by insurer, and by the services that you're providing.
Okay, I have another question. I think this might be for you as well. Can I bill for a facility fee in addition to the physician fee for the services I provide in my OBL?
That's going to depend on the insurer, and that's part of your initial investigation when you're going out to insurers to find out what it is they cover, the services that you can provide. That's definitely one of the questions you're going to ask them. Can we bill a facility fee in addition to the professional fee for the services we're rendering?
Okay. I think that's probably all the time we have for today. We do have a number of other questions, but just to keep according to our time schedule, we're just about 2 minutes before the hour. So here's where we'll wrap it up. The information for the presenters, the contact information is on the screen. Happy to go ahead and feel free to reach out to them directly if you have additional questions. I know we do have at least 5 or 6 others that we did not get a chance to get to. Thank you for your patience with our technology issues today. It's the kind of the world we're living in, and unfortunately, with our Zoom world and doing everything online, it's just the nature of the beast. But really appreciate your time today, and we will hope to see you soon. Again, reach out to talk to us if we can answer any questions for you. Thank you so much.